Do you want to learn more on how to put money to work in regenerative food and agriculture? Follow our video course via investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/course or in the links below. Now, on to the podcast. You won't be listening to a typical episode of this podcast. We'll take a deep dive into greenhouses for the production of vegetables. Why? Because the middle class in Asia, Eastern Europe and the Middle East is booming, and they're going to their local supermarket and they're demanding fresh and healthy vegetables, which are now trucked or flown in from thousands of kilometers away. So get ready for a lesson on soilless, high-tech greenhouse production, CO2, freshness and urbanization. Enjoy! Welcome to another episode of Investing in Regenerative Agriculture, Investing as if the Planet Mattered, a podcast show where I talk to the pioneers in the regenerative food and agriculture space to learn more on how to put our money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities and ecosystems while making an appropriate and fair return. Why my focus on soil and regeneration? Because so many of the pressing issues we face today have their roots in how we treat our land, grow our food and what we eat. And it's time that we as investors, big and small, and consumers start paying much more attention to the dirt/soil underneath our feet. Before we get started, I've been recording these interviews next to my day job, and I will definitely continue to do so and release about an episode a month. But at the same time, I would love to take this further, share more interviews. There are many more stories to share on investing in regenerative food and agriculture. More depth, improve the quality, maybe even doing some video series. So I started a Patreon community, which makes it easy to support creators like myself. If these podcasts have been of value to you, and if you have the means, I invite you to support me and make this happen. For more information, please find the link to my Patreon account in the description below. And now, without further ado, the interview. Enjoy! Welcome to Investing in Regenerative Agriculture, Investing as if the Planet Mattered. I'm Koen van Seijen, your host. Today I'm talking to Dirk Aleven, CEO of FoodVentures. FoodVentures develops and operates high-tech greenhouses close to markets and cities with large vegetable imports, like Kazakhstan, Turkey, Japan, Georgia and Ukraine. Regenerative agriculture in this case is mostly focused on the regeneration of local communities, bringing production and jobs closer to the consumer and not so much on the soil aspect. But we're going to ask Dirk all about this. Welcome, Dirk.
Thank you, Koen, for hosting me.
And to start with a personal question, how did you end up in the world of building high-tech, sustainable greenhouses in places like Ukraine, Japan, Georgia?
Well, that's a good question indeed.
You must be wondering yourself. You must be wondering about that yourself every now and then.
Yeah, I'm not educated in agriculture. My first company, which I started back in 2004, that was a meet-in. We were organizing all kind of business trips for Dutch entrepreneurs to emerging markets. So we were traveling with groups of entrepreneurs to China, to Brazil, India, Eastern Europe, all kind of places. And one of the things I noticed was that almost in every big city and emerging markets we were entering, the international retail was already active, and they were complaining about the supply of fresh vegetables. So basically they could get all the supplies they needed, but the issue of fresh vegetables was pretty big. So I noticed that the Dutch are one of the best worldwide in producing fresh vegetables, distribution of fresh vegetables. The whole chain is one of the most professional organized industries around the globe. So we started looking into that, and first idea was to see if we could support the industry to export their technologies to new markets. But that was already done. We saw pretty high-tech greenhouses built everywhere around the globe. In fact, 90% of the Dutch or 90% of the greenhouses worldwide outside of Europe are supplied by Dutch technology providers. But the real issue was that nobody knew how to use these new technologies. So we visited several greenhouses in Eastern Europe, which were underperforming. Yields were, 30-40% less than expected, and then
which is a problem because these are huge investments per hectare. We're going to dive into some numbers later, but if you're underperforming here, it really is a problem as a unit, because they're high tech and require a lot of cash to start, a lot of capital, and then you don't want to be 30-40% under your targets, I guess.
Absolutely, it's absolutely a huge issue. The issue would be even bigger if it was in the Netherlands. Then for sure they would face financial crises followed by bankruptcies. The fact that they didn't in those markets was simply because the prices for the goods sold was pretty high. So the low yields were compensated by extremely high prices. And that was explained by the fact that these markets are net importers. So they were importing. Well, Russia, as a good example, is importing tomatoes from as far as Israel, Spain, the Netherlands, shipping them for like 3,000-4,000 kilometers by refrigerated trucks, bringing them to the consumers. So you can understand that the prices for the fresh vegetables are extremely high. Another example is Asia, whereas Malaysia is importing by air freight Dutch Trust tomatoes. So the export price of the Dutch tomato is roughly 80 cents, where it ends up at $4 per kilo in Malaysia.
So just to get it right, they're flying in Dutch tomatoes from greenhouses here in the Netherlands because there's not the level of sun you might expect to Malaysia to supply supermarkets there.
Well, everything is there in Malaysia.
And everything is flown in? Wow.
Like technically, you could absolutely produce in Malaysia, but nobody does it today. So they're forced to import it. Same goes for Singapore. Perhaps you've seen the news that the Dutch growers are extremely proud on the fact that they can supply bell peppers from the Netherlands to China, air freight. So it's ridiculous. So we're
Let's not even start about food kilometers there.
So this was the reason that we got interested in this industry, and we've noticed the huge lack of know-how on how to grow in high-tech greenhouses. So we decided to do it ourselves. I had no know-how in growing either, but I was lucky enough to involve Dutch growers into my business. So we locked in some really experienced Dutch growers who already had experience in growing outside the Netherlands as well, in Mexico and in Russia and among other countries around the world. And we started our first project in Ukraine, building a greenhouse to produce salad, which we are supplying to the local supermarkets in Ukraine. So that answers your question a bit on how I ended up building greenhouses in Eastern Europe by accident and by seeing the need that we didn't only want to export technology, we wanted to invest ourselves, commit ourselves, and transfer the know-how to use the technologies.
Because otherwise it would be one of those many cases where something very high-tech is shipped from, in this case, a very high-tech country. It arrives, maybe it works for a bit, and then either it falls apart or starts, like you said, underperforming, which we've seen 1,000 times in history and probably will see 1,000 times in the future as well, with something high-tech coming somewhere where there's no, let's say, good ground for something high-tech. I mean, unless you're operating it yourself.
Yeah, in other industries, you do see better examples where technology and know-how go hand in hand, and operators are more professionally organized and connect themselves with the technology providers. For instance, in the oil industry, who would even consider buying high-tech equipments without an operator involved? I mean, that's absolutely nonsense. So
how come it's not like that in the high-tech greenhouse industry?
I guess because the industry in the Netherlands is developed over generations as a mom and dad business. So it's mainly family-owned businesses. Rather like smaller scale. Now we're entering a phase where there's more consolidation and the companies are getting bigger. But so far, it has been literally thousands of growers in the Netherlands organized through corporations. So not having the right scale nor the interest to go abroad. So the operators themselves, they love the Netherlands, which I do as well, but they feel comfortable here, and they have the whole industry organized in the Netherlands, and they have no interest in going abroad. Investing in Ukraine or Kazakhstan or whatever, it requires a different skill set than just being a grower or just being the best grower.
And to look at Ukraine as an example, can you explain why first of all, why the shift to supermarkets, and thus also more off-season vegetables, and why you cannot just grow them on outside on a non-high-tech, not inside a high-tech greenhouse. Why is it such an interesting country and such an interesting example for your approach?
So I guess what happened so far is that in Ukraine, people had the time to grow some of their vegetables in their backyards. And now more and more families are depending on two incomes. They're living inside the cities, so there's a huge urbanization, like everywhere in the globe. So they don't have the time to go outside the city, go to their dachas, their family gardens to grow vegetables. So they start buying the vegetables in the supermarkets. And once they are in the supermarkets, they expect, first of all, a fresh vegetable. They expect it to be available whenever they go to the supermarket, not depending on the season. And they expect it to be safe, because they think and expect that the procurement department of a supermarket is paying attention to quality and food safety. So that's the consumer end of the part of the case. In terms of supply, there's still a lot of smallholders which do not make that transition from the traditional seasonal production to more extended production, so throughout the year. So there's a gap between like the more professional and modern consumers and the old-fashioned way of producing tomatoes and cucumbers. Now it looks, for some of them, it looks like it has a sort of a nice sound of having outside grown vegetables on a smaller scale. The reality is that those suppliers, they use a lot of chemicals because they have a huge influence of weather and insects outside. And there's absolutely no traceability. So in fact, there can be good suppliers, of course, if you know them. But there is also a big group who wants to have a decent yield out of open field production. But they have a huge pressure of insects and all kind of diseases, which they fight with a high doses of chemicals. So we think that there's a better alternative if you do it in a protected environment, a controlled environment, and have the right scale to prove your traceability of the products and the safety of your products.
And that means in this case, close to the consumer, or relatively close to the big urban areas, you are building, or you have built in this case, high-tech greenhouses and are operating them as well.
Absolutely, yeah. If you compare that with other industries like bakeries or something, I mean, you would be surprised if the supermarkets buy their breads from thousands households who are baking the breads somewhere in the backyard. But that's in fact what's now happening in Ukraine with vegetables. So we think it's more logical that you have a more organized and larger scale production of vegetables close to those markets who are depending on imports right now.
And when you look at, I mean, the moment somebody says greenhouses, everybody immediately thinks, or not everyone, many people will think energy use, sustainability. I mean, you already highlighted a bit on herbicides and pesticides. Can you talk a bit about the energy use and sustainability in general, as obviously the sector in the Netherlands has been moving away from heavy gas and heavy energy use? I mean, what are the things you've seen and the things you have put to work in this case in Ukraine and in other countries? So
I totally agree that a few decades ago nobody was caring about energy inputs in the Netherlands, and that's the reason why some people have bad memories or a bad impression on the industry itself. Like today, everybody is, well, from a sustainability angle and from a financial angle, looking for alternatives on energy, because the energy use in the end makes like around 1/3 of the cost price of your product. Plus, consumers start asking, how do you produce your goods, and what is your source of energy? In Georgia, we are using geothermal energy. So in fact, we're almost not using gas at all, and the gas that we use the carbon dioxide coming from it as a fertilizer for the plants. So we're CO2 neutral. In Ukraine, we use biomass as an alternative energy for two reasons. First one, to be more sustainable in our heating, of course, but second one is that the gas is expensive in Ukraine, so we also want to have alternatives. And again, the gas that we use is purely from the need of CO2, so we're almost CO2 neutral there as well. And in Kazakhstan, we're using cogeneration. So by cogeneration, we're using flare gas. That's gas which normally is burned, simply burned after the oil production, so not used at all.
These are the big flames you see on top of pipes if you live or if you happen to live close to oil production or refineries.
Exactly. And we're using that gas and generating electricity from it, and the remaining heat, which is coming from this electricity generation, we're using for heating the greenhouse. So it's if I look at the industry today, it's in the genes of every grower to think about energy saving, and the suppliers. Like if you look at the energy consumption today, it's almost like 60% less than 20 years ago, and that's one of the reasons why the old greenhouses are now disappearing in Ukraine. They were still used to very cheap gas in the Soviet Union, so their gas consumption was extremely high.
And they're super leaky, basically.
Yeah, super leaky, and they didn't have any strategies on how to use energy. So today the know-how is developed as such in the Netherlands that the growers they know when heating is absolutely required, when it's sort of less comfortable, and when it's not needed. So they look at the absolute need and say, well, in these periods of the day, we absolutely need heating. There's no alternatives on it. Or they might consider, well, we could use a little bit less, and that results in extremely lower gas consumption.
But it does sound funny or weird that I'm burning gas to make CO2, something we're all trying to fight to have less of, for my plants in the greenhouse to eat. I mean, you can imagine for non-greenhouse people that it does sound a bit weird.
If we would only use it for generating CO2, I would totally agree. What we do use is we work the other way around. So we say, how much CO2 do we need, and in what period, and then we burn the gas. With that burning process, we create heat, which we store in a heat storage tank, and that heat storage tank we can use the heat at the moment we need it. For instance, so in the greenhouse, all the greenhouses that we build right now, they have these heat storage tanks. During the day, when the plant is extremely active, they use a lot of CO2. So we start heating or burning the gas. We store that heat in the heat storage tank, and when the plant is asleep in the night, but still needs like a nice temperature, we use the heating which we have stored in the heat storage tank. So it's not that we are purely burning the gas for the purpose of CO2 dosing.
It's a dual use, basically.
Yes, absolutely.
And would it be, because I've heard and I'm following that industry just a bit, like the carbon capture industry that's trying to drastically lower the price of capturing CO2 from the air and making it available for industries like maybe the greenhouse industry, of course the bottling industry that needs it for your Coca-Cola bottle. Would it be something, but then you don't have the heat, would it be something in the future that you could be, as an industry, clients of this new emerging industry that hopefully for a very low price will be liquefying CO2 so you can use it? Is that something you're dreaming of?
Yeah, absolutely. Because it results directly in higher yields. So the plants immediately transform CO2 into tomatoes or cucumbers. So we would absolutely be buying CO2. As a result, like the beauty of a greenhouse is that it's a direct user of heating and direct user of CO2. So you could connect those greenhouses to, for instance, energy plants or any industry which has a waste heat. The disadvantage today is that if you have waste heat only, you still have a lack of CO2.
You could supply that if you could take those two things apart,
that would be fantastic.
At the moment, there's no CO2 for a good price for you guys.
Yeah. Well, there is. So it's a matter of math. So sometimes we are interested in buying it. You see that happening in the Netherlands, where the industry is more developed. So distribution of liquid CO2 is better. That's a bit of a problem in countries like Georgia and Ukraine and Kazakhstan, where the industry is not that developed yet to supply us liquid CO2 at a reasonable price. Otherwise, we would definitely consider not using any gas.
Very, very interesting. And when you look, let's tackle another big one. People that say everything should be grown in soil. What's your normal reply to that?
So we would need a drastic reduction of consumption of vegetables. I mean, let me take an example in Georgia. We took over a greenhouse which was underperforming, and it was producing in the soil in a greenhouse. So we took over and we started. First thing we did was taking samples of the soil, and it was absolutely exhausted. After 3 years already, we could see the results as well in terms of yields. First year was more or less reasonable, and then the yields went down by 20 to 30% per year, and the soil was completely exhausted. So I do understand, it has a bit of an industry feel on a natural product with growing soilers. So I do understand that people have question marks about it. So how we use it is that we are growing soilless, means that we're using substrate, and that allows us to dose exactly the amount of water and fertilizers that the plant needs, nothing more, nothing less. So if you look at things like water consumption, for instance, our water consumption in a soilless environment is 10 times less than an open field production. And that's getting extremely important in countries like Kazakhstan, where there's a lack of water at the moment. In terms of fertilizers, we add the fertilizers through the water. So and we have a drain system. So whatever the plant is not absorbing, we collect it in the drains. It's coming back in a drain pit, which is cleaned with UV again, and then we reuse those same fertilizers. So we reduce 30% compared to a non-drained system, and if you would compare that with an open field production, that's even more. So in those terms, we're much more sustainable than open field production. So my answer would be it's more of a question like, how many people do we think we can feed on this planet? And I think we all understand that there are more people coming, so we should be finding ways on reducing the inputs, maximizing the outputs, so that we have a maximum transformation from input to food.
Yeah, I think it all depends on the context, and you should depend your tomatoes compared to something that apparently is flown in or trucked in from 5,000 kilometers away, and all those kilometers also mean inputs in the sense of diesel for the truck, diesel for cooling it, etc., etc., etc. And in terms of, because I mentioned that at the beginning, in terms of jobs, and then we look at a concrete example on how do you finance it, but what is because they're super high tech, meaning probably less people and mostly automated. How many people are working in an average 1 hectare or half a hectare high tech greenhouse with you?
So rough numbers are 10 to 15 persons per hectare. So we're in a normal scale greenhouse. So we have 2 small ones, one in Georgia, which is 2.5 hectares, and we have around 60 persons working there. It's a little bit more because you need all your overhead stuff like sales, administration, distribution. We do our distribution ourselves, so we supply directly to those supermarkets. But the one we're building now in Kazakhstan, it starts with 5 hectares and it's growing to 20. That will be starting point roughly 70 to 80 in the beginning, and then we'll end up somewhere around 200 to 250 people working there.
And that's year round because you're not seasonal, which is a huge thing in agriculture.
Yeah, absolutely. And we aim to keep our staff as much as possible. So in Georgia, we have the same staff since the beginning, because in the end, the yields are determined by the know-how of your staff, not only the grower, of course. So we wanna make sure that everyone who works with us stays with us. So we pay very decent salaries. We try to create like very transparent culture and conditions, so that people absolutely know that they're safe working with us and they have a long-term vision on working with us. And as a result, we see also that people are starting to spend, which is very nice to see. Like on the first year, they simply work for a salary, and in the second and third year, they start feeling security from the company and also start developing their spendings back home in the families. You have to try to imagine an environment where the unemployment is roughly 30 to 40%, that's in the countries that we work in, and especially in the countryside. So the difference we can make for those who working with us is huge.
Yeah, and let's not forget, you need customers to be able to buy your produce at the end.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
Because, I mean, it would be great if you automate. No, that wouldn't be, but it could be like an entrepreneur's dream to automate everything. But at the end, if nobody can buy your tomatoes, who are you producing for?
Yeah. And in fact, there are too many inputs in the greenhouse to fully automate it. So there's it's a living product. It needs attention.
It's a hybrid, yeah. And in terms of in this case Kazakhstan, if that's a great example, can you dive a bit deeper into some of the numbers, if you want to share them, just for people to have an idea of how asset heavy and capital heavy these type of investments are, and what comes out of it, and how you're structuring it now, because you're thinking about a fund, you're thinking about different vehicles to speed up, basically, because you can obviously not finance it all yourself.
Yeah, so it's absolutely an industry which requires a lot of capital. So the setup itself in Kazakhstan is that we start with all the infrastructure works and the head house and the overhead buildings for 20 hectares, plus a first 5 hectare of operation. That investment we're doing right now, this year, that's 18 million euros. That includes the cogens, that includes all the overhead works and the 5 hectare operation. This particular one we funded, we are co-funded by an agricultural fund, which is the Silk Road Agricultural Growth Fund, a private equity fund under international management, and we invested ourselves along with them. We had $12 million in equity, and the remaining in local debt. That allows us, of course, this first phase to be up and running, but as well the second 5 hectares. So compared to the first 5 hectares, we expected a budget of 18 million euros, and the second one should be done for another, let's say, 12. So we end up at 30 million for the first 10 hectares operation. That's high, but that's high because of the large part of which is coming from the cogens. So normally you would look at roughly, like the rough numbers, 200 euros per square meter, so 2 million per hectare investment.
And you're about 50% up, but also because you're already building most of it for 20 hectares, right?
Yeah, and that cogen part. So our returns are also higher. We generate our electricity ourselves.
So your fixed costs are higher, but your input costs are a lot lower.
Yeah, exactly. So the cogens itself have a return of 5 years. Normally we look at the greenhouses as well, based on a 2 million euro investment per year. You might expect a 1 million euro revenue per year, and roughly, let's say, 300 to 400,000 EBITDA per year. So let's say, if for as long as capex divided by EBITDA is less than 6 or 7, then we're absolutely fine.
And in this case, you finance it. You mentioned local debt. That's a local bank, or how did that work? And you mentioned equity, which came from this fund. Is that a normal setup for you guys?
Yes, so it works. So what we see in now, what's happening is that there's quite an interest in investing in agriculture. So we are looking for those kind of funds or investors that are interested in fixed asset investments in agricultural and which has a decent return. We come in as an operator, we invest along. So we show our commitment, we run we tender the construction, we build it, and we operate it. So that's our ideal structure. That could be through a fund, so where we collectively create a fund, which is where we as an operator are also part of it, and we start building and operating greenhouses in emerging markets. Now we're focused on this part of the world, Central Eastern Europe, but we are interested absolutely in the Middle East, which is a heavy importer of vegetables, and in Asia, to see if we can do a similar setup as we've done in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, I saw that. I think Emirates just ordered a gigantic indoor farming operation with one of the startups that from the US.
Yeah.
To supply their airplanes, I think, or I mean the people in their airplanes at least.
Yeah, that's on salad. So that's pretty interesting to see indeed.
It's extremely interesting. And so that fund would be, just to sketch a bit, are you planning that for next year? Are you planning that for this year? Or what would be more or less the size, and what would be the fund investing in? Is it debt? Is it equity?
So currently we're focused on closing the financial structure on Central Eastern Europe. So that will be in itself a fund focused on this part of the region. That's already funded and will be finalized this year. And then we're aiming to set up a new structure coming year for different regions. There will be a fund not on debt, but owning the assets as well. So ideally, I would see a setup where we can raise a fund up to 100 million, which would require us to build 50 hectares in 3 or 4 locations. So ideally, you would have 4 regions with a scale to grow up to 15 to 20 hectares. That's the ideal size that one management team can run. So it requires 1 grower, a set of junior agronomists, 1 sales team, 1 distribution team, and then you have your ideal setup. So if we would like to build such an operation for 50 hectares in Asia and Middle East, it would require roughly 100 million, and that could be a combination of equity and debt. But the fund that we're setting up, that will be purely on equity.
And what do you see in terms of interest from investors? You see a strong interest in agriculture, but I can also imagine maybe these countries are not the first ones on the list, and high-tech, mostly sustainable greenhouses aren't either. What do you see from investors when you pitch this and when you share this?
Well, actually, I do see quite a big interest in greenhouses, especially in the US and Canada. There are larger greenhouses. Some of them now are set up for producing cannabis for a medical use, and they're absolutely large scale, even listed at stock exchange in Canada. So I see more professional, industrialized investors, large scale investors interested in greenhouses, but I do see a lack of operators connected to it. So the suppliers are there for the greenhouses, but there's a lack of professional operators who can run it. So I'm pretty optimistic in raising equity for those funds. We have several funds who are working with us right now who also have a mandate wider than Eastern Europe only. Eastern Europe in itself was quite a challenge, especially during during the last 5 years, where we have been working in Eastern Europe during very turbulent times of devaluation of 50%, of a crisis between Russia and Ukraine. Of course, the sanctions on Russia. So, the last five years have been rough, but still we managed to raise quite a substantial amount of equity, and we are showing good returns.
And I want to be conscious of your time, so I want to close off with 2 questions, actually. One, Imagine there's a room full of smart impact investors and investors listening to this who are interested to get into regeneration in general, so not just soil, but also definitely local communities and of course fresh produce. What would be your, without giving investment advice, but what would be your advice to start and look at first? Where would you advise them to learn more about this sector and how to get involved?
Yeah, so the most sexy stories are about high-tech or new high-tech developments such as vertical farming. And those attract a lot, like a huge amount of capital right now. My advice would be to try to avoid stories on marketing and like all kind of how to say sexy stories on the industry. In the end, it's food that needs to be produced on reasonable terms at a reasonable price for a consumer. And on vertical farms, as an example today, I mean, I'm very interested in. I see the industry as interesting, and I see the technology as promising. But today, capex per kilogram plus opex per kilogram cannot even be close to what we can do in high-tech greenhouses ourselves. So it doesn't add up in the end, and it's a niche product for a niche market, which is in itself interesting, but you can't scale it. So my advice would be just to always make sure that you keep your numbers right and compare it with the industry standards to make sure that you have a competitive advantage in the longer run. I don't think a business case could survive on marketing only and saying that vertical farming is the solution, so consumers in the end are willing to pay 3 times more on the product. In the end, consumers are willing to pay a premium on a good high quality product, but not 3 times more. So I see the investors in the agriculture, like the professional ones, they are not distracted by any stories, but they keep the numbers straight. So that would be absolutely my advice. The other one is agriculture comes in, well, it has its seasonality on pricing, and it has a large influence on year by year on open field production and the competition with open field. So you have to have quite good nerves and not getting nervous if one year it's less good than the other year in terms of pricing. So it is a long-term investment that you're making, and you should be ready to overcome bad years of pricing or bad years of yields, which you can't always influence.
No, I think that's extremely good advice. And to end, if you could, from the sustainability point of view, like wave your magic wand and change one thing in the greenhouse industry, maybe it would take 20 or 30 years. What would you change? Would it be the source of fertilizer? Would it be even better predator insects that you're using? Maybe the CO2 part? What would be the highest point on your list that you would love to change to make your greenhouses even more sustainable?
I guess it's in energy. So energy would be the combination of electricity and heating, and I do see like huge opportunities in the tropics where there is a high amount of sunlight, but the temperatures are not correct, so you need to cool it down. Now, for obvious reasons, you would think about using solar energy in such locations to supply your equipments with energy to cool down. Now that doesn't always work, because that you need the same sun for producing your goods as well. So you need the same sun for the plants as well. If you can somehow develop a greenhouse which has glass on top, which can generate electricity plus still leaves enough sunlight for the plants, then that would be absolutely a game.
And maybe even shade it in a way that they don't burn.
Yeah,
they don't let through too much, so you need to cool less, and so it becomes an interesting.
You have a lot of so basically you have a lot of surface on a greenhouse and the buildings around it, enough to equip solar panels, and I think that's a very promising combination: greenhouses and solar panels
to really harvest the maximum amount of solar energy you can get for both electricity and your solar
and your plants.
Solar plants on your plants, basically. Wow. Thank you, Dirk, so much for your time, and I'll definitely be checking in your developments, and have a great day.
Thanks, Koen.
You just listened to an interview with Dirk Aleven of FoodVentures. I hope you learned something about vegetable greenhouse production and the business case behind it. Thank you for making the time to listen to this podcast and making it all the way till the end. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you found the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast valuable, there are a few simple ways you can use to support it. Number 1, rate and review the podcast on your podcast app. That's the best way for other listeners to find the podcast, and it only takes a few seconds. Number 2, share this podcast on social media or email it to your friends and colleagues. Number 3, if this podcast has been of value to you and if you have the means, please join my Patreon community to help grow this platform and allow me to take it further. You can find all the details on patreon.com/regenerativeagriculture or in the description below. Thank you so much and see you at the next podcast. Dear friends of the podcast, I'm super excited to share with you the online video course Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food. How to put money to work in regenerating soils at scale and growing a lot of tasty food while doing it. Why are we doing this course? After 100 interviews and more than 100 hours of audio asking the question how to put money to work in regenerating soils, and I've been following the space since 2011 and recording these podcasts since 2016, we thought it was time to share our lessons learned. What have we seen in this space over the last years? How have we built our decision-making framework? What to focus on with the podcast? How have we picked interviewees? What questions should you ask? What is happening in the space? What should you read? What should you listen? What should you watch? How to approach this space? For whom is this course? You, the soil builders and investors in this space. The soil builders, people working in this space, entrepreneurial farmers, fund managers, vehicle builders, crowd investing, platform builders, ag-tech companies, farm-to-gut food companies, permaculture, keyline designers, holistic management consultants, etc., etc. People that are building soil at scale. And the investors who are putting their own money to work through their family office or as private individuals, or people who are putting other people's money to work through foundations, institutional capital, banks, insurance companies, etc. Is this course free? No. This is pay what you think it's worth. Meaning, I have no way of knowing what this course will be worth to you. And I'm very aware that among the listeners of this podcast, we have people with very different means. So I'm inviting you, if this course is creating value to you, and if you have the means, to consider paying what you think it's worth. Thank you. So what is this course? It's currently a series of 17 videos, mostly ranging from 10 to 15 minutes, plus PDF slides, so you don't have to ride along. We're gonna look into why invest in regenerative agriculture and why extractive agriculture is so risky, how to invest, what kind of frameworks you could and I think should build, what to invest in, what kind of co-investors you could find, or what kind of investors you could find if you're a soil builder. Every lesson will have a digging deeper part where I will share what kind of reports, what kind of interviews, what kind of videos you can look into if you want to dig deeper. We're going to look at nutrient density, landscape design, and a lot more. So what is it not? It's not a list of investable deals. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist in this world. We're really at the beginning of the regenerative agriculture and food revolution. It's also not investment advice. Before making any investment, please find professional investment advice. So get ready, get a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, or whatever you're drinking. Click on the link below, sign up, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback.